Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the next episode of StreamTime Sports. My name is Chris Stone. I'm the community lead, joined as always by our CEO, Nick Meacham. Now, Nick, one of the words that's going to get mentioned quite a bit today is anonymity, which makes me think of Finding Nemo with a C and anonymity. But we're going to talk about sort of strangers, anonymous profiles, all these sorts of things, Nick. But I do think there are a lot of bad things with social media. We talk about them at length, but one of the things I find really interesting is fans can now directly interact with athletes in a way that's never been done before. And speaking of anonymous, one of my favorite little things is when you think you found out that a professional athlete has a social media burner account. I think Kevin Durant's the most famous for having a burner account where he would kind of send comments to people that maybe were dissing his game, things like that. I don't know, Nick. Have you ever seen any of these burner accounts? Or have you ever considered creating a LinkedIn burner account to really tell people what you think?
Have I ever considered creating a burner account? I have considered it on Twitter back in the day when I was using Twitter more actively for a bit of fun because I get told of this stuff with sports through Sports Pro. I'm like, oh, I'd really love to share that. I was like, maybe I could be cheeky here and create some sort of anonymous account publishing some stuff to disrupt a bit of the conversation going on the platform. But I held back from doing that. Kept everything above board. But yeah, the Kevin Durant example is probably the best one that I can think of where the burner got found and he got held to account as a result of that. But I did see recently obviously there's everything going on at the World Economic Forum right now of everything you could possibly imagine around politics. The one person suggested every social profile should just be you should have to be officially like authorized in the same way like a LinkedIn profile would. And I was like, that sounds so ridiculously obvious. It blows me away. But I wonder how long it'll take to get to that sort of point. But no burners here, Chris. Not that I would admit to anyway.
No burners. We're proud of our opinions, and we'll have those hot takes, and we'll be accountable for those. So no issues on that one. But I know someone that I enjoy watching on LinkedIn, seeing his posts. I know he also is very proud of his statements and stands by them. We've got two guests today. The first one is Abis, CEO at Dizplai, and we're also joined by Joe Edwards, the marketing director at Dizplai as well. And we're going to have, I think, some opinions thrown around because I mentioned the word anonymous is going to be used quite a bit today. And you guys recently released a report, your anonymous fan index, and there's some alarming findings from that in terms of anonymity with fandom and what that means for sports. So Ed and Joe, appreciate you guys joining us today to give some opinions on what maybe some of this data gap means for the sports organizations that are in our ecosystem.
Thanks for having us.
So Ed, just to kick things off, we've spoken with you before. You've been at our events at Sports Pro before, but even Nick and I were talking a little bit beforehand. Dizplai itself seems to have gone through a bit of an evolution over the last couple of years. So before we really dive into this fan index report, maybe for those out there that maybe aren't as familiar with Dizplai or maybe knew you from some of the other work that you guys have done in the past, just talk really briefly kind of where you guys have been over the last couple of years in terms of your growth.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having us on this. We really appreciate it. It's good to chat stuff through. So, yeah, I suppose as the old adage goes, evolve or die, we realised that ultimately, whilst we did lots of really cool stuff for a number of years, and, we were very much famous for, how could we get fan content into video, that in itself, it wasn't necessarily moving the needle for the people that we were working with. Great to do it and great to drive engagement. But as we become more and more of a business that is thinking about how can we help the people we work with to monetize attention, that we had to evolve the business model of what we were doing. And if we wanted to be true to the things that we really, really believed in as well. So a lot of the work that's going on in the background at the moment, and part of obviously this report that Joel talked in more detail about, is about, okay, we know that we live in a fragmented media world right now where content's distributed and fans are everywhere. I see that as a massive opportunity, but I know that lots of people are scared of that. And whilst I do talk a great detail about all the different opportunities for that distribution to connect with audiences, that I'm never saying that ultimately the legacy world that we've come from is necessarily bad either. I'm just saying it's just different now. And I always think about content marketing, content distribution, probably from that marketing perspective rather than from that media perspective, in the sense of, if you're a good marketeer, which I am long since being a marketeer, Joe's a good marketeer, I am definitely not. You have to think where your audience is, and you have to create different segmentation strategies about where your audience is and ultimately how you get to them. So this thought process that Joe had come to with the anonymous fan index was like, okay, then, so let's start to quantify that and start to think if people agree with us was a starting point, but also then to see what kind of information we got out of that and what insights we can then deliver to the wider marketplace, because I think people are often scared, I would say, to talk openly about these challenges. Like, no one wants to go to their CEO and say, I only know about 10% of my audience, because it's career suicide, right? But I think if you can say it more in an environment which is controlled but anonymous, then we can start to maybe talk about it. And that was the view of this.
I'm curious, guys, when you were putting this together, how did you define well, two things really. One is what do you define and classify as a fan? I mean, we've all probably seen over the years, let's say differing variations of that from particularly certain Premier League clubs that will tell you they have more fans than they do, so they have more fans than they do people in the world. Just curious on how you guys defined that to begin with. I think that's obviously can take you in a lot of different directions where you draw that sort of border.
I mean, yeah, so I'll probably take this one just quickly. I think obviously fandom has various different levels in it, in terms of, hardcore fans all the way up to, casuals. But I think ultimately the way that we were trying to define this was you have your known fans, like people that are sitting in your database and that kind of thing. And then everyone else. And everyone else is typically somebody that's watched something or somebody that's kind of following you on social media. So we try to actually keep it fairly kind of black and white and plain around how we define that, to be able to quantify things, because obviously we can do quant or you can do qual. And we definitely went with the quant to try and begin to look at how we can define the kind of lost opportunity, I guess.
What was the dynamic of the rights owners you saw completing the survey? Was it skewing more sort of challenger sports property? Was it quite a cross section of organizations from top to bottom and vice versa? Or how did you find that mix?
Balanced is the right word, in that there's obviously more tier one rights holders than there are challenger rights holders. So we kind of saw that through the report, really. But it's kind of a balance of the industry, I would say.
I would just say, just to really kick this off, go download the report. I'm sure when we post this, we can put a link in the podcast description, whether you're watching it on Spotify or YouTube. I know if you go find Ed or Joe on LinkedIn, they'll have posted the link to it. But go find it, read through it. But I think one of the key findings I took from it, and like I said, is kind of a alarming statistic, or at least this is what I saw as the big synopsis, is that sports organizations only have identifiable information on 24% of their audiences. I think that was kind of the average number. So to think of all the billions of dollars that have been spent on media rights, on sponsorship deals, on marketing, on your tech stacks to build all these things together, something around 3/4 of fans, we don't actually know their information enough to do something actionable behind it. They're just a social media account, something like that. Is that sort of an accurate way to kind of put what one of the key findings was? And if that is, what is the opportunity or the scale of the challenges that represents, Ed?
I was sort of looking back in my own sort of very long career, and from back when I worked at Burnley Football Club a long, long time ago, when I was pretending to be a marketeer, and I think that was the period where, gosh, like 20 years ago, where everyone was going really deep on CRM systems, and how do we start to have that one view of the customer, which certainly in my time that never happened. And I know for a fact, having had lots of interactions with football clubs and sports organizations since, I think there's probably very few that even now would say that they have one view of that customer. And where Joe was touching on then about how do you define a fan? In fact, look, yeah, you find a fan by, yes, it's watching it, but also saying, yeah, I support that team or I support that particular club, rather than just they've watched it, right? Because ultimately, I'll watch lots of teams that are not Burnley, but I only support Burnley. So we've got to be really clear on that. But I think I just, as you do, having worked with people that I've worked with down the years, and when you have different conversations and where they're not overtly telling you that they don't know this, you just know by some of the work that you deliver, when perhaps you're giving them insights that they don't have. And having done what I've done in the past, I know that, how do you not have those insights? Because I was doing this kind of stuff years and years and years ago. And I think we'd got to the point where internally, anecdotally, we knew a lot of this stuff, but we wanted something to back up that we knew this stuff. And look, right, like any good research, what you would hope is what we've done. This does not stop someone else then taking on the mantle and going, you know what, I want to delve into this more now. I want to actually understand Nick, might be your guys, right? You might decide to do something. Go, you know what? I like that particular thing, and we want to look at that in a little bit more detail. Great, we're all for that because we just wanted to start the conversation because I think yes, there's always that sense of we want to get across what we do is ultimately our future goal is to help people to through the way we see it through content to actually start off-platforming people from those networks where they've been chasing reach but not necessarily chasing conversion. You know, being honest, that's why we commissioned this. That's why we decided to do this. Have you got anything to add, Joe?
I'd just say that I think it's also important to remember that there is value in anonymous fandom as well. You know, it's just that the revenue per fan is a lot higher once you know them because you've got more opportunities to sell to them. And you know, I've worked for and in and around lots of kind of sports organizations in my career, and there's a real kind of levels of maturity in terms of technology and data and like resource to make a lot of this stuff happen as well. So I think like ultimately, you know, the way that Dizplai is, I guess, trying to head is very much about how do we help people that have got these, you know, massive amounts of reach, but stop treating those reach channels as reach channels and start thinking of them as acquisition layers. Like, how do we actually start really driving the funnel at every single touch point in every single way? And I think it's about people realizing a little bit more that the kind of engagement tools that are around like these big reach channels, they're not gimmicks. They're not. I mean, they may feel like gimmicks to the fans in terms of it's a bit of fun to be had, but actually there's a real need and requirement to be engaging fans in places that we don't know them to drive them back into the funnel, basically.
Reading the report, I think it's a really well put together piece of work. So well done to you guys for putting it all together. And some of the conclusions and the way you've presented things is really clear and quite poignant. I was reflecting on just the like kind of the value of focusing on those anonymous fans, because obviously people would say that the more you know your fans, you know, the better off you'll be, and that makes sense to a large extent. But at the same time, when I hear a lot from like clubs and particularly football clubs, but also some major leagues, is they're only focused on bigger, more followers, more eyeballs, reach to the cows come home through social media, and they're gearing up their media teams and so forth to drive that, because those big numbers allow them to sell more, but you know, sponsorship deals at a bigger rate. I remember even seeing a recent investor presentation from one of the more prominent investment firms, and the number one thing they talked about in terms of how to like work out a valuation is based on follower numbers on social media, which kind of blew me away. Obviously got to work with what you've got, but I'm just curious on that sort of, I guess, conundrum or that challenge opportunity versus, okay, if we put all our energy, because resource is somewhat finite, right? Pushing people and growing on social media and so forth is obviously there, and what sports has been quite good at for some level because of its value in the eyes of a fan. But how getting them to not be anonymous, how much work and resource has to go into that? Is there something that have the clubs you're working with or the leagues and rights holders you're working with, are they able to really ramp up the amount of people coming from anonymous to known, or is it still really tricky to get that balance right and make it worth investing resource away from just building huge social media audiences?
And just as you were saying that, I was thinking about like just a couple of conversations we've had in the last couple of weeks, and I think if you can get back from this perspective, for a long time probably. Let's focus on football clubs, right? Because I guess I'm sorry, Joe. I know you're not a football person, but for me, I'll focus on football clubs for this answer this question. A long time, chairman and board of directors just didn't have the innate knowledge to understand any more probably than the reach figure. So that's what everyone chased, right? But we know, because we've been sat in a couple of meetings, even in the last couple of weeks, where the board are now turning around going, well, all this investment and all this reach is fantastic, but where's my conversion? So when the board starts asking that question, then it's bound to filter down. I think for a long time, even till mostly recently, I just wasn't seeing those questions answered. And I was going to meetings saying this, but no one felt like they necessarily needed to do anything about it, even though they understood it was a problem, because no one up above really understood what the problem was. I can see the wheel starting to turn now, and we've not necessarily instigated that. That was it just so happened in the last couple of weeks that that's been the case. When that starts happening at board level, then you know that it becomes a problem, right? And they're questioning, like, all this money we spent to drive reach and to, let's be honest, feather the nest of big tech to grow their networks. Where's our cut of the cake? Because we're not seeing that necessarily coming back. And interestingly, the big networks, because we speak to them too, are saying, we don't understand why people have not been focusing on the conversion, because we just assumed they would.
I think in terms of the balance, I feel like I've been in sports for about 10 years and in agencies 10 years kind of prior to that. And I think I've seen a shift now into the need to kind of acquire more data. I'm not saying that social media networks are disappearing anytime soon, although they might be disappearing for under 16s in the UK pretty soon. As somebody that wants to own a community around a topic or a sport or a club, you need to get to know your fans, and you're only going to know half the story when they're sitting out on social media. So I think a lot of to try and answer your question around balancing resource against going for reach versus going for engagement is the never-ending challenge of any good marketing team. I would argue. I agree with Ed that I think the story has very much changed in rights holders around, like, there's a certain point where you're going, well, we just keep pumping money into media and we've got to try and find a way to actually see some like tangible results. It's a lot easier for the football clubs. They're all, well, not all, but, it's a popular sport, right? Everyone knows that sport. When you get down to some more the challenger brands, actually, they have to go down the engagement route because they just don't have the reach. And actually, that's probably where you see, a little bit more innovation in and around that engagement space rather than the kind of reach.
Also, just to add to what Joe's saying there as well, because of the nature of what we've done for a long, long time, we've ended up dealing with media teams and content teams and social media teams and the digital team that's not the social media team. And I've done this back when I was at the coalface, where I was just doing sales and not running the business, where I would get in a meeting room often and I would be introducing some of these people to each other because they didn't actually know each other in the same organization, where, again, me putting my old marketing hat on, which I've not got anymore, sat there thinking, why are these dots not joined up? Because it just feels the most obvious thing in the world that they should be speaking to each other. And often we find ourselves, when we've dealt with some of these organizations, where what we are doing is ultimately a marketing process, but we get lumped in with production, and production are just producing content. And when you talk about, but this is a marketing mechanic, that's those guys over there. Oh, no, they just interfere and then I can't make the content I want to make, which, like, is madness. But often as a vendor, right, you go, well, okay, like, how much do you push it? Because you're always scared that the reality is if you push it too much, they don't want to work with you anymore because you're asking far too many questions. But I guess hence why I've been on LinkedIn. I've evangelized for the last couple of years. I can't just hit in and say nothing because it frustrates me, because it's waste ultimately if it's not being done in the right manner. And we want people to drive ultimate value out of what we do. Otherwise, we don't feel like we're being true to ourselves.
Well, I think this highlights we've used the word conundrum a couple of times. I think it perfectly exemplifies this question. But one of the things further in the report was talking about what are the channels with which people have the largest time creating conversion. Well, the issue is it's largely broadcast and social media. So there's this conundrum that the two channels or mediums that are best for driving reach also turn out to be the worst when it comes to trying to then convert that into conversion. So you've got this conundrum, as you say, the reach and conversion, the two, the things that you think might be a little bit easier, like signing someone up for a direct-to-consumer platform, signing someone up to a loyalty program. Those things tend to be easier to get the information on, but they're also not the things that necessarily grow reach. And finding that balance between the two, because like you said, your report comes out and says that those two things aren't necessarily complementary, and trying to solve, I guess, maybe that gap in between those two.
Yeah, I think it kind of comes back to not my first point, but one of my previous points, which was kind of about treating reach channels as acquisition layers. So you're right that they're actually, like, social media channels are very, very good at acquisition, right? But just for themselves, ultimately. They're really, really good at turning those audiences into revenue. And and they'll happily obviously take all the content in the world from us to help fuel that as well. So I think ultimately, like I said, it kind of just comes down to like, how do you treat these things as more acquisition layers? You know, how do you create the conversations that you need to be had? How do you encourage fans? And actually, like one of the other things, if you know, social media seems to be on a bit of a downturn over the last few years in terms of engagement on platforms, and you're seeing more and more people going to, you know, private conversations rather than sharing everything about themselves. And I think actually, as humans and as audiences, we naturally want community, and that's the bit that we need to try and tap into in these reach channels, is how do we bring community into these wider things. And that is one of the methodologies and ways that you're going to kind of attract those audiences, and then you work with those audiences. Once you've got more data, you can work to drive revenue. It's not like we're looking to try and take them straight from the, you know, watching TV or watching a game for the first time into buying a piece of merchandise or a ticket. You've got to spend some time bringing them into the community, helping them understand the community, helping them understand their place in the community, and then kind of feed in more kind of commerce and commercial propositions as you go.
Innately, I think, Joe, you pointed to the whole challenger sports side of things earlier, and I think that's probably an important delineation as well, because I remember years ago when Volleyball World got invested into by CVC, and one of the first things they did is put everything behind basically a paywall into their platform. And many people reacted to that. Particularly, I've a lot of volleyball friends who are from volleyball, and surprisingly, most of them absolutely loved it, because before they didn't actually have access to the content in the first place. Whereas obviously in the top tier of sports, particularly let's say football and other major leagues in the US, that content's already available quite readily in different places. And therefore the ability for a sports property, in this case it was Volleyball World, to build not only a platform that fans actually want, you know, that's a different thing to begin with, but they actually getting access to something they didn't have. And also, I guess, to be actively supported versus on those other platforms, to build a relationship directly with the fan, is what I was referring to. That isn't the same necessarily. There is variations and levels of that for a tier one, but not in the same way that if you're a challenger, like you can't get visibility and real estate on some of these platforms because you'll get pushed out by the bigger top tier platforms. So you have to build your own destination. Otherwise you'll never be able to build that relationship in the first place. Whereas I think, my thesis is the tier ones, the clubs, the leagues, etc., that are getting the rights checks and so forth thrown at them or whatnot, they can actually pick and choose their strategy a little bit more, because people come to them because they've got that huge reach and follower base, so they can still turn that into some sort of monetization. I don't know if that is something that you guys see from the conversations and the work you're doing. Is there quite a divide of the importance, therefore, of knowing your fan, particularly at the challenger level?
I think at the challenger level, I mean, even the report shows that at the challenger level, there's definitely more going on around that space. I still think it's important for the tier one teams. It's more of a conversation than it ever was, or tier one sports. And yeah, I mean, I'd kind of tend to agree. I think there is a delineation there that you've highlighted.
I mean, you look at, we always look to the American sports, right? What the big American sports do, the NFL and the NBA, and the reality is they've got infinite possibility to distribute their content via lots and lots of media companies that will pay them as much money as they can. They still look to how do we do different types of distribution via creators, because we understand there's a fan there that we don't reach over there. So if they're doing that, it should send a message to everyone else about right message to the right people at the right time. Like 101 of marketing, right? It's actually not rocket science when you think about it. But again, if you've got media rights people driving that agenda, then it's not necessarily linked into the overall marketing strategy. Then you only go a certain kind of way, and actually it all needs to be. It's in a lot of ways. If you think about the organization, we've also fragmented down the years: the media, the marketing, the social, the digital. Like it needs to be brought back together again. So there's one focus, and there are some organizations starting to do that. And you can see it by the way people are starting to hire now as well, realizing that they're actually facets and going back to putting it back as one organization or one sort of department within the organization to make sure that you're not, all these things are not falling between the cracks?
The word communities come up a little bit, and there's a few sort of buzzwords that we're hearing quite a bit. So community is one of them. Democratization. I think I've heard the word democratization probably a million times over the last 12 months. Authenticity, particularly now when we start thinking things like AI slop and things like that. There's all these kind of like words to sort of build brand loyalty, and this idea of, I think, having more devoted fans and getting to know more about them. But I think we typically hear those words more with maybe some of the disruptors that might be the challenger sports, or maybe the new content creators that are coming into the space. I think sometimes bigger media organizations can perhaps struggle with community or authenticity because the message is it's so high up, and it's usually really PRified and things like that. But in terms of getting more fan knowledge, what are you seeing from content creators or challengers that are doing a better job of building that community? Ed, when we spoke before this, you gave the really great example about the World War II podcast and like how they created a community off of that. Just what perhaps should the larger organizations be paying attention to some of these disruptors and their ability to build those communities?
Yeah, we were talking about, weren't we, Goal Hanger, because I'm friends with Tony, the founder of Goal Hanger as well, so I know quite a lot about that business and the evolution of it as well. But everyone sees the rest is football now, and the rest is history, and the rest is politics, that are these massive, I mean, they've transcended podcasts now. They're media entities in their own right within a larger business. But they started out with We Have Ways, which was their Second World War podcast, which was Tony going into a bookshop and realizing that actually there was loads of Second World War books, but nobody had really done a podcast, and sort of lent into doing that. And as they started to do it, they realized that the fans of the podcast were creating these little groups across the country so they could meet up and talk about the Second World War. And the community drove how they started to think about the content they were making, so much so that's evolved now. And then they have Warfest every September, Neil Silverstone race circuit, which, it was the first time I've been, and Tony had been telling me for years, you got 5,000 people were at this festival, camping in feet, like watching talks about the Second World War. Like, think about the most niche thing you could probably go for, showing that actually you can turn that into a big media business as it was, and that's that, right? And you could argue, because everyone looks at Golang and oh yeah, but Golang are huge. Yeah, but they weren't. They started out somewhere. They were a production company that started to dabble in podcasting, and then it just snowballed from there. But you look at the likes of what Mark Goldbridge has done over the last 10 years, what Robbie Lyle has done over the last 10 years. Like, they started out because they felt like there was a gap in the market to speak to fans in a way that fans expected to be spoken to, but more importantly, to be listened to so they could help to drive the conversation. And they now have regularly conversations with hundreds of thousands of fans on a daily basis that feels like a one-to-one experience, but the reality is there are hundreds of fans as part of it. And the big thing, and you can ask Mark that, you can ask Robbie that, and you can ask Tony, that they keep coming back to is like, we build communities. We build things that people want to be part of because they know they get listened to, and they know that they help to drive the narrative. So they feel like they're almost co-creating with us. I don't believe that tier one organizations can't do the same things. Like, again, 101 on marketing, listen to your customers. Like, they'll tell you what they want.
Yeah, I just, even looking outside of sport. So, authenticity is definitely the marketing jargon word, but just frankly, just keeping it real. And, yes, I do think organizations can help build communities, but communities generally start organically from the bottom up. And actually, it's about identifying what those communities want. Outside of sport, so I don't know if you guys know a guy called DJ AG, but he's the guy that pulls up on the side of like King's Cross or whatever, live streaming, and he's got like Alicia Keys, Stormzy, all these kind of like incredibly famous music artists just pulling up because he's created something authentic around him. And frankly, like needing police involved to escort. I mean, I think Busta Rhymes was there recently, which is, it's crazy. And it's on the middle of the street in London at like 2:00 in the afternoon. And off the back of that, he's now launching his own festival, and that's one single guy who's built a community up around it. So I think the point of what I'm trying to say is actually like finding that real thing that people care about is the most important part. And when we can talk about all these like engagement mechanics and all these kind of wonderful words, that we all tend to use in marketing, actually, the only way it's successful is if you create something that people want. And that's the key to all of this. It actually doesn't have to be that hard. You just have to know what your audience really, really, really genuinely want and what the community are talking about.
Great stories that resonate like with people. It's I'm going to throw another one in for there, Chris. Storytelling. But it's like these are all great stories that people think, yeah, that feels authentic, that feels real, that feels like it's something that I want to align myself with.
It feels like that you have there's some sort of mix. I haven't really got a list, but I've been racking my brain with like key traits of some of the stuff we've been talking about. And I feel like there's a conundrum a little bit for sports where we see, and Ed, you talk about this quite a lot through your different channels as well, that there's such a build around creators, right, today. People following people. The example you guys just shared then as one of countless. The problem sports might have, I think it has right now, is that conundrum of they aren't a person, they are a club or a league or a competition. They have incredible assets in athletes, but building up, using those athletes through the right way can be seen as tricky for some of them because those athletes, particularly on a club level, might move on to another club down the line. And you don't want to just spend all your time building up one or two players if they're not going to be part of the ecosystem.
Marco from Juventus talked about that, Nick, in Madrid a couple of years ago when I was on a panel with him, when he talked about they had the conundrum of Ronaldo moved on and suddenly the social audience went like that, which is why they created the creator production center there at their headquarters, which was like, we have to start to find a way where we're embedded within the fan base that in theory your fans are never going anywhere, right? So like we've got to focus on what's always going to be here, and then the Ronaldos are coming, great, we'll take the boost when it comes, but that's transient, they'll move on. So sorry to interrupt.
No, I think it's probably one of the better examples out there, right? Of you lean into someone's brand but it can go as quickly as it comes when you do so. But I guess there's that predicament, right? Of how do you see it for sports? I mean, you could probably say it's equal opportunity as it is a challenge, I suppose, to some extent. But that conundrum of the whole world's being built around people, personalities, etc. How would you talk to a sports property and say this is the way to kind of manage that opportunity and challenge to keep building a really strong audience relationship with them? Because people are following people, and whilst at a top tier of a club or a competition, you might have a really strong fan that will live or die with a club or organization. There are also all of those casual fans underneath, which actually make the core numbers of fandom in sports that aren't so committed to a club, and they could disappear if something changes, poor performance, a player leaves, etc.
There's there's three parts to it. The first part is patch them while you've got them. Is obviously point one, because then if they do decide to unfollow your social media channel, you still got a chance to talk to them in a one-to-one method. But one of the things my previous boss spoke a lot about was the idea of hope and memory in the psyche of a fan. So I think, like, particularly those transient fans, it's about pulling on the memory part as much as you possibly can, and again thinking about ways that you can engage those audiences through memory, through things that have happened in the past, and triggering those things to build that fandom, and actually hopefully increase it to a point of where they're not leaving your social media channel because the best players just decided to skip off to the Middle East.
As a Bengals fan, you just mentioned hope, and that's all I have. I don't have memories of good things.
Well, I started supporting the Jets this year in my infinite wisdom for the first time, and I lost all hope after the first game.
Yeah, that's bold. You don't often hear too many people joining a club like the Jets at this sort of point of their journey. I'm curious, guys. There was a lot of great data points in the report, and we can point to a couple of them. But were there any that really stood out for you, either as important points for the industry, or more just surprised you, perhaps? I had a couple, but I was curious if you had any standouts. Maybe Joe, starting with you.
If I'm brutally honest, I wasn't overly surprised by the data that I saw. And maybe that's just because I've been fortunate enough to work in like some tier one sports and some challenger brands. So kind of had a good feeling what the story was going to end up telling us. What was, I guess, the one that was interesting to me was the bit around how organizations are starting to feel more pressure from sponsors about kind of more tangible outcomes and less kind of awareness driven CPM based metrics. So I think that's a thread that I kind of want to look into and follow a little bit more.
The fact that people were willing to almost quantify how much money they thought they were losing, and I think actually they were probably being really conservative. But the reality is that they were picking out figures would suggest that they were already thinking about how much they're losing at the moment. And the reality is, if you're going to be upfront and say how much you're losing, it's always going to be a much smaller than the figure that you're actually losing. So I think, we can only go off what people have told us, but I think the money that's being lost in the industry is multiples of what people were saying.
Yeah, it doesn't take much to really move the needle on some of those data points, right? If you can improve your conversion rate by a few percent plus increase the total audience base and known audience base by a few percentage, you'd be surprised how significant that can be to revenues. For me, that some of the things that stood out was, again, you talked about the amount of money being lost by not being optimized the right way. I think that was quite conservative, some of those numbers. That, again, depending on the scale of organization, of course. But I thought also the anonymous fan bit, I think was a 24%. They said they had, was it, sorry, I'm getting the other way around. 76% was the
Anonymous.
I reckon it's more like 85 or 90 in a lot of instances plus, depending on the size and scale, because there's too many people that are just, again, to my point earlier, focusing on social media as their core platform, and they haven't been focusing on getting that audience. And that would be a pretty impressive conversion rate, I think, to get 1 in 4 people into your known ecosystem.
Yeah. And even before this report had come out and when we were doing it, like, I was speaking to 1 or 2 sort of leaders at sports organizations, and I did a bit of my own research just using AI just to sort of prove the point on some of these things. I said, look, even AI is telling you that. That's before we've even done the report. So if AI can tell you that, and you don't know yourselves, but again, you can look at it in a negative way. You can go, actually, this is opportunity. Like, okay, line in the sand, that's where we are, but we let's move forward. Okay, let's start to put some plans in it to work out how we actually do this. And again, look, great, people can work with us to work that out, but there's lots of other ways you can do it too. So we're not suggesting for 1 minute that other people don't have good ideas about how to do this. We just felt quite passionate, having sat there talking about this, that we wanted to get something out there and have some proof points with it as well.
One other interesting point, or I had a couple, but the one was that they were suggesting, I think 41% said that social media provides the most data from the touch points they had. I thought that was quite interesting, particularly as we're talking about anonymous fans versus known, that still a lot of rights holders are leaning into social as their core, like, source of truth for who fans are, given we know that, what we were talking about before about profiles might not be...
which was interesting, right? Because as much as, yes, it gives you a lot of data in terms of reach and likes and it doesn't give you much data in terms of individuals. I mean, because everything's anonymized, right? Because for GDPR and things like that, they have to anonymize all that. So it's interesting what they're referring to when they say the data they're getting, because it's certainly not on a person level.
I took that more as perhaps they really aren't leaning into their known first-party data, and they use the social data of like the macro numbers as their single source of truth, when they're using as sales tools and the like, was my estimate on that one. And the other one I thought was quite interesting was that which channels are the hardest to convert anonymous into known fans, and a quarter said their own website, and it was nearly as high as social. I'm like, if you think that's the hardest one, you are in for a rude shock if you really look into the other platforms. But that also shows the opportunity, putting a positive spin on that is there.
Well, that's something everyone can fix relatively quickly, right? Because they're in control of that.
You would think so.
Speaking of fixes, just as we start getting close to wrapping things up here, we've sort of identified some of the problems, the challenges, some of the conundrums that exist. What would you do, or what would you start or recommend someone start to do? And, we acknowledge that different organizations are at different maturity levels when it comes to their data collection and data capture. But if you had to start saying, now we're talking about this problem, we have objective, quantifiable numbers, we know it's an issue. What are the things you're going to start doing in terms of, Is it how you speak to the board level about saying that these metrics matter? If the top believes in it, it'll follow through. Is it about investing in CRM databases? What are the things that you were saying if you're going to try to start to right the ship?
If I was to put my marketing only hat on and not think too much past that, to me, it's just baking in acquisition at every single layer and level you possibly can do. And it doesn't have to be offensive in the way that it's done. It needs to work naturally within the channel that it's in. So that would be me with my marketing hat on. Me with my business owner, board member hat on would genuinely be looking at making sure that there is a metric discussed at the board every month or quarter around a known fan base and what the customer lifetime value is. And those to me are probably the two most important metrics that should be being discussed at the board level.
For me, from a strategic perspective, what I talked about earlier was ensuring that your media content marketing function is unified and that you don't let things fall between the cracks. Because ultimately, if you're making all this content over here, but like I said, you're not putting the acquisition metrics that Joe's talked about in, you're just making content for the sake of making content because none of that is driving to what your ultimate goal is. Like, look, we know that you want to get your storytelling and your messaging out there and project yourself, but what is the end goal? The end goal is, in simple terms, bums on seats in some way, shape or form, right? Because you still function as a business, which drives shareholder value. You've got to unify, for me, the whole marketing media content function.
Obviously, Joe, you talked about acquisition. I think, we're obviously talking about acquisition in terms of new known fans, I'm guessing is the primary focus there. Are there any examples that you guys have seen where you mentioned Goal Hanger, Ed, earlier as an example, and I listened to a recent podcast with their CCO that's got a bit of coverage as well, where he talks about they reached, I think it was like 250,000
memberships.
subscribers.
Yeah, that's right.
Memberships. I'm just wondering, have you seen anyone launching something like that is really working, that is resonating with a modern day audience? And then the answer might be no, but I feel like that is the next step where if more sports rights owners can create a real thing of value, not just an add-on, but a real thing of value, and fans will be lining up for it because if they feel like they're supporting their organization, supporting their sport club or whatever it might be, and they're getting something really back in it, not just content, but I think it has to be something a little bit more. Is there anything else that stands out to you guys?
I can only go one from personal experience, actually, and it was with a challenger brand. And ultimately, the fan base was more about participation than it was about traditional fandom. And actually, we created a tool that allowed participation and community to happen. So there was an element of content, and the pros were included in some of the content that was within the experience. But ultimately, it was actually about how do you get more people being active at the time. And that really resonated and worked very well organically. And I think, again, it comes down to, I haven't seen a lot, if I'm honest. I feel like it's the traditional OTT platform, membership, merchandise, and ticketing, right? And that's what's driving the predominant acquisition layers at the moment. Yes, you've got things like fantasy and all that other kind of stuff. But no, I don't think I've seen anyone or heard, at least in the last few years, of anyone doing it exceptionally well. But yeah, it comes back to knowing your audience, knowing the community, knowing what they want, and then working ways into that are of genuine value.
Yeah, and honestly, I'm same. I mean, the good example of Goal Hanger, because that's the one that's most relevant for me right now. And I remember having this conversation with Conrad and with Tony. Trying to think when it was last year now, when I think they were at about 170,000 members, and the goal is 250,000 in this time frame. And I think Conrad said, I'm not saying anything private, because I think Conrad said it all in the video the other day, that they were aiming for April to get to that 250,000, and they got there by like the second week of Jan, and that's now turning over them £1 million a month in membership revenue. And they've done that through selling access. Like, they've just announced that they're doing The Rest is History, I think, at Hampton Court Palace, only for members. The members still have to pay to go, as far as I'm aware. And they've done the same for, tickets for the different live events that they do, or for book launches, or you get access to the Discord channel where And I know Tony said this to me before as well, that they used to get guests on a lot, and the rest is history. And the fans, the members, overwhelmingly said, no, we only want to hear from the two presenters because that's what we tune in for. That's what we watch it for. So they actually listen and they take that on board. But they're really good at communicating back to the members, saying, we listened to you, this is what we did. And again, comes back to that conversation community. But what the membership is giving access, and I think there's a value exchange there that the members of Goal Hangers memberships have truly understood. I think you can be part of the fantasy game for Rest is Football as well. They've got different things for different shows. You often don't see that in the same kind of way in football. It often skews the other way, that they don't get the same value, because it's kind of like, if I've got a season ticket, why do I need to be a member as well? Like, the Cintiq for me is my membership. Like, that is the ultimate membership as far as I'm concerned as a fan when I buy a season ticket. I don't think there is any higher. But then you see these memberships creeping in now, trying to give a member something who pays a third of what I pay for the same thing. I'm like, I don't see the value exchange there, and it's no surprise that people don't really buy into it.
Absolutely. Well, Ed and Joe, we do have to wrap things up. I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Like I said, we will post a link to find the report. Do go have a read through it yourself. There are some interesting statistics. We didn't even talk about my favorite topic, which was in there. There's a section on piracy. I personally love piracy. I can't open that can of worms a day. But if you're like me and you love piracy, it's listed in there as well. So Joe and Ed, really appreciate you guys coming on today.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.